Good afternoon, everyone. We're here today to talk about how Family First fits us. This is our first DCFS all Zoom meeting, so we hope that it all works well and that Becky and I know where to look, but this is a first time for us, so it could be very interesting, but we will get through it. We're excited to use technology to hopefully save time and resources and be able to communicate with each of you out in the field. So I hope it was easy to get on Zoom and you can hear us, but if not, you can always email our technology guys who are here helping us, and we'll fix it for the next time, right guys? We'll fix it for the next time. So today, if we want to go ahead and show the PowerPoint, it'll be shared on your screen. We'll give it a second. Okay, you should be seeing the PowerPoint now. And today we're talking about Family First Fits Us. And that's our little catchphrase to talk about the Family First Prevention Act. And we're just going to get right on in. Becky and I'm Misha Martin, Director of DCFS. This is Becky Dunnigan, Deputy Director. We have a lot of information to cover today and not a lot of details because this presentation was really to give you a good introduction of how our values and our initiatives fit in with how the new legislation related to Family First impacts our practice as well. And then over the next several months, you will be getting trainings in your area with more of the details. How to use CRIS, what exactly do you take to court, all those details of implementation will be coming to your area or maybe via Zoom. This is our first, so if it works well, we're gonna try and use technology more, but the details are for another presentation. Now, I will say, as Becky and I prep for this meeting, we still have a lot of information that we want to cover today, but it's really important to us that we get to your questions and answers. So if for some reason we go long and we do not get to the question and answers, we're going to take those down and we will make sure to put out answers to each of those questions. But again, I am not going to be able to tell you exactly what CRIS screen it is, but there will be a training coming to you in your area of exactly how that works. So let's dig in. Okay, let's go. So we really first have to start with our value. Every child deserves a safe, stable family every day. And y'all have heard that from me. You've heard it from your leadership in your area. And it really means a lot of different things. It means kids should be with bio families if they're safe and appropriate. They should be with relatives if safe and appropriate. If they can't be and they're in foster care, they should be in a foster home unless they need treatment. And then we get them treatment and move them back to a family. It also means adoption. And so that's our value in Arkansas, and thankfully the new Family First legislation really fits in with that value as well. When the law was passed, the idea was that kids belong with family, which means the feds are investing in both prevention services to try and strengthen those biological families, as well as placing kids with family. And we know these two concepts should equal better outcomes and permanency for children, because we all know we do not want kids lingering in foster care. So to get to how did the feds actually persuade this, like feds do, they tied it to money. So thankfully our values align with the law, and then the law allows us to pull down additional federal funding in two ways. There's limited federal funding when children are for children to be placed in families, basically meaning there's very little other placement options other than families and treatment that the feds are going to place. And then second, the states are allowed to use federal funding to pay for prevention services for children. So there's a lot of requirements for that, and we're going to get a little bit more detail a little bit later on, but it's not open-ended prevention. It's in very specific cases. So we're going to kind of keep moving through. So back to what the feds are going to fund as far as placement. So they're going to fund foster homes. They're going to fund relatives, but there's going to be limited funding for that residential care without a treatment component, meaning if kids have to go into emergency shelter or a residential placement, they will only fund 14 days. And that really aligns with what we've already been doing. They're going to fund treatment. You go into treatment, you work on discharge planning, you work with your local team, and you move out. And then there's some other specialized sex trafficking victims, prenatal, postnatal youth parenting, some licensed residential family-based treatment programs for substance abuse. Some of you may be familiar with like Wilbur D. Mills, Arkansas Cares. In Arkansas, we've really looked at what our priorities are and how to contract with providers. And our priorities have been, how do we get our contracts aligned with the 14 days? How do we get our contracts aligned with QRTP? and then moving on down the chain as we have the opportunity to do such. I'm gonna turn it over to Becky.
How to ensure kids grow up in a family. I'm going to talk about old practice and new practice. So, for instance, children and teens that cannot safely stay home, they should be with relatives or close friend or fictive kin. So, old practice would be that teenager goes to the emergency shelter. Grandmother comes forward, and we've always had the ability to look at the grandmother. But we see that the grandmother has a 15-year-old neglect charge. Old practice would not even be to consider that grandmother or to go out and assess that grandmother, right? New practice is assessing the grandmother. Can you assess the grandmother? 15 years is a long time. Plus, we're talking about a teenager. We're not talking about a 2-year-old. So assessing the grandmother and seeing if the child can safely be placed with the grandmother. Now, that would require an alternative compliance. But yes, the new practice would be looking at that grandmother today instead of looking at that the grandmother had a 15-year-old neglect charge. Children should grow up with their siblings. Old practice would be the siblings are acting out after a visitation, the siblings are fighting. So old practice would be we need to separate the children, the siblings. New practice is let's keep the siblings together. We can work with the therapist. It's normal behaviors. We all fought with our siblings when we were growing up, right? So that would be the new practice. And then looking at placement at a higher level of care should be based on identifying needs. This is an example of residential care. Sometimes we placed teenagers in residential care, and they were placed in residential care, and 4 years later, they were still in that residential care. The new practice is it's for treatment. And it's discharge planning. We do not want our children, even our teenagers, to go live in residential care for 4 years. We need to start thinking outside the box. We had a case recently that Mary and Joseph lived in residential care for 4 years. And after 4 years, we found the local staff worked really hard to find a fictive kin. Mary and Joseph are now with a family after 4 years of living residential. They found a fictive kin family that they're living with. So that's the new practice, and that's what we have to think about is how to ensure our children and our teenagers grow up in a family.
So how does that fit Arkansas? Now, before I get into some of our progress, I just want to piggyback on what Becky was saying, because Becky used the term assess frequently, right? Because Becky wasn't talking about black and white rules. There's not one example that Becky just gave that you go back and you say, well, Becky said X, Y, and Z, so I have to do this in case. What Becky said was we need to assess the situation. We need to assess what's right for these kids. We need to evaluate what our value is. So just kind of going back to that value that every child deserves to be in a family. If what you're doing on a day-to-day basis is not aligning with that value, then you need to be raising that to your supervisor and on up the chain. Maybe you need a better understanding of why you're doing what you're doing and why it's best for child. Maybe if it's about a specific program, you're reaching out to the program manager in central office to talk it through and say, does this policy really align with our value that every child deserves a safe and stable family? But ultimately, it's an assessment of the individual case with an understanding of what our value is. And so how does this fit Arkansas, right? Because Becky talked about the expectations of the federal law, but how does it fit Arkansas? So thankfully and gratefully, you guys have been doing the work when it comes to placement since 2016. We as an organization set goals that we wanted to put our kids first, and we believe that kids belonged in family. And so we started tracking and looking at certain things such as emergency shelter, reduced use of residential for younger kids, increased placements with relatives and fictive kin, residential placements for kids in the highest level of institution placement when not needed for treatment, increase in placement stability. So we're going to go through some of this progress. Now these numbers are through March, but go back March of 2016 and then on up to March of 2019. I mean, look at children placed in emergency shelter longer than 14 days. I mean, that is a huge reduction in the number of children, and that is because of the work of you guys to ensure that kids are placed in families. And, you know, it goes back to, are we making decisions that are best for kids, Or are we making decisions based on resources? And you guys have clearly said we are going to make it a priority to get kids with relatives and in families. Children 12 and younger in congregate care or residential. Residential placements, sometimes they're termed residential treatment, but many times it's just a residential placement. We had a huge number of our young kids in residential placements, 221. Look at that reduction, 46. When kids are with families, like we've already mentioned, they're quicker to permanency, increasing those visitations, really working those cases. That's great, amazing work. Placement stability. Now, what I will say is I'm super excited that we have reduced placement stability, or actually, increased the number of placements that kids have, but 6.02 is above the national average. We can do better by our kids. So while I'm super excited about the work to make kids more stable, we have to really continue to focus on this. But there again, when you're looking at that individual child, how are you making a good placement decision for that child, right? So an example of that might be, yes, we have oversight if kids have been in a shelter for more than 14 days, but that doesn't mean that if you have a placement lined up on day 16, you move them for one night and then move them to another placement, right? Because that doesn't go with our value and it doesn't go with what's best for kids. So understanding the policies, but also looking at what's best for the kid. And then children placed in acute, subacute facilities on contract, which means it is no longer medically necessary for those children to be in the highest level of placement, but because we do not have a less restrictive placement, they are sitting on contracts, and those kids are growing up in institutions. Look at the amazing work that you guys have done to discharge plan, to work with your community, to work with the providers. I mean, this is a huge reduction, but we still have work to do.
The new continuum of care. This is just what you'll see in the new continuum of care. Of course, some of them are some of the same programs. I mean, you're recognizing provisional relative foster home, private license agency, TFC. Where I want you to see that may be different is our provider family style care for sibling groups. That is still going to be residential in CRIS. And we'll talk a little bit later about the provider style family style settings that we have maintained, or the provider family style care. And so in a later slide, we'll give more details on those. But this is the continuum of care that we have now. And again, the one will be a little different in CRIS, but we are making sure that we want you to understand what that provider family style care is for our sibling group.
And I know Becky's going to go through that in just a minute, but just to add on to that, just because it's still in CRIS under residential and it may have a residential license, we've really been working with those providers so that their care looks different.
Absolutely, and there is a slide on that in details later. So this next slide is a very exciting slide. This is probably one of my favorite slides because it's, the things, everything we've already been talking about and all the work that you've been doing since 2016. But if you look at this is family-like setting placements. This means every one of these children are already in a family. And right now we have a little over 4,300 children in care. 3,531 are already in a family. So there's already a lot of work that's been done. So I think that is key, and this is one of my favorite slides because it does put all together all the work that's been done in the last 3 years to keep children with families.
So we're going to talk about the different types of placements in those family-like settings, and we have to start with relatives first. So when we're talking about relatives, there's a lot of misnomers out there about, oh, we don't place with relatives because this or that. I've heard it like, oh, well, they're more likely to be abused and come back into foster care, or, oh, the relative won't support permanency, or they just give them back to us. Well, I can tell you that there may be a case or two like that, but as a state, when we look at our data, there was less maltreatment with relatives than any other type of placement. Will you go back one slide if you don't mind? There was increased stability in relative placements where the first placement was with a relative, and you can see these numbers on the PowerPoint. And then there's increased permanency. So our kids who are placed with relative are least likely to experience maltreatment while in foster care, more likely to have stability, which one is not only good for kids, but as workers, that's good for you and your workload, right? I mean, those relatives still need support, but that's less kids on your workforce that you're having to find additional placements for. And two, you're moving kids to permanency, whether that's reunification, whether that's with a relative through subsidized guardianship, or whether that's with a relative for adoption. We're seeing increased permanency when we place with relatives. And then, here's a little bit of a good side and a downside. The good side is over the last 3 years, as we focus on relatives, we have seen an increase in relative placement. I think the downside to that is I think we can do better. I think there's more relatives out there. And one indication is when I look at other states. Now, when you see these numbers on other states, these are actual foster homes in other states. So those relatives in other states who have been opened as a provisional and placed in with a relative. So as you can see, every surrounding state around us has an increase of open relative foster homes. Now, I don't believe for 1 minute that there's more relatives in Mississippi, Louisiana, Oklahoma, or Texas, or Missouri. So I know that maybe we're doing a really good job of opening relatives initially on that case, because that's what the focus has been. How do we get them with relatives initially? And there's some amazing stories out there. I mean, I just heard one from Jefferson County just last week, and there's some amazing stories. But what about these kids who have been in care 2-3 years? Are we really looking at, did we give good consideration? Did we deny a relative over space? Was there another, maybe that relative wasn't stable, but they're stable now. So are we looking at our long stayers? Are we evaluating multiple relatives? Really looking for relatives, because that's a key to what's good for kids, and it's a key to what's good for our workforce.
And I'll give you another example of relatives. We know that we have a lot of our foster children have experienced a high level of trauma, have a high level of needs. So does the relative need additional support? And maybe they need more support than what you think they could get just through the regular foster parent system. So we've recently had a case, Destiny. And what the staff did and worked with Megan and Bridget on with Destiny is they opened Destiny's relative up. It was relative or fictive kin up as a therapeutic foster care, so they could get that additional support. So think outside the box when it comes to relatives. I hear a lot, well, grandmother can't take care of him. His behaviors are higher need than grandmother can manage. Can we work with our TFC provider and open grandmother up as a TFC? Because we all know there is a lot more support that goes in the TFC. And we recently had a success case with Destiny. So think about that when you're thinking about relatives too. Thinking outside the box, reach up to the program managers, to Bridget or Megan, to get that support as needed. And speaking of that, this goes into, talking about thinking outside the box when you're recruiting that relative for Destiny and getting that relative trained and connected with a TFC provider. So foster homes. The current number of foster homes is 1,563. Only 40% of our foster children ages 10 to 17 are in a foster home or in a provisional home. And we can do better than that. But I think we have to think of the Destiny case. What can we do to think outside the box? And recruitment is everyone's business. It's not just the resource. It's not just our partners. It's everyone's business. And again, the example with Destiny was working with the staff in central office, and the foster care worker was the one that worked to think outside the box and get Destiny, who had been in residential for many years, into a family.
So provider family style care, but I can't leave recruitment's everyone's business without just making a comment. So, and I think, I've said that in the past, and I do mean you should be recruiting people in your community, everybody, but really getting creative, like Becky is saying, on that individual child. Who are their teachers? Who is their counselor? Who is their connection that is exploring the possibility of placement? How do we get them information? How do we foster that relationship? How do we maybe talk with that local team and talk about whether visitation is appropriate? Again, assessment, individual cases. I'm not saying black and white rules, but we have to think creatively on what do we really mean by we want every child in a family. So looking at provider family style care. Now, we have come up with this term, and it is a term that we describe as a provider who has a home, who has house parents, who's focused on siblings. So no shift staff, no rotating house parents, That family lives in that home that's owned by the provider, and it looks very similar to a foster home. So we are terming these provider family style care, okay? And so the feds are not funding this type of care, but we have said as a state that we value them and we value the role that they play in the services that we provide to our children. So for the next year, we have extended or created new contracts with those providers that meet this criteria, and they serve approximately 180 children every day. They're partners who are committed to our values and working alongside us. And so there's 12 providers who we have made a commitment to continue to fund until June of 2020. We will continue to work with them and figure out our next steps because we know that they're providing a service that is good for our kids. And some examples of that might be Arkansas Baptist Children's Home in Monticello. If you've been there, they have homes with house parents. Help me out, Becky.
Young's House in Sebastian County.
That's right. So yeah, Young's House, and let me just say about Young's House in Sebastian County, they came to us, I think the first or the second month I was director, and started working closely with Becky to say, what is it that your kids need, and really partnered with us. And we're leery that the house parent model wouldn't work, but they have become believers, and they have seen the outcomes and the way it works with the children. So we know that it's good for our kids.
And the Young's House was one of the ones that initially started putting siblings together all under one roof, instead of your boys in one house and your girls in another house. So that is part of this provider family style care, is getting our siblings together.
And I'll just say, you will still see these as residential only or residential treatment care in Chris until we get that fixed. But just because they're still under that title doesn't mean that they're the exact same. So organizations that didn't have kids under the same roof or weren't focused on siblings but wanted to continue with us in a family style care, they're partnering with us to make those changes. So then your next continuum of care is qualified residential treatment program. And this is where you'll see a lot of your traditional group homes have changed with us to qualified residential treatment care. This is not the same old, same old. The feds are requiring a lot of things that we actually agree with, and we're looking at when we wanted to reprocure our new residential contracts. Trauma-informed treatment care. In order to go to these programs, the child will have to have an assessment and determine if they have serious emotional or behavioral disorders. Family members and the local team has to be involved in the assessment and planning for this child. Now I put in bold and highlight. Discharge planning and family-based aftercare support up to 6 months after discharge. But what this also means is we cannot put kids in residential and walk away and do nothing. We are not going to have kids living endlessly in residential. They're going to be getting treatment, maybe up to a year, hopefully less if that's what they need it. And we're going to have to be working with the TFC provider, with a relative, maybe with bio parent, whatever is appropriate. But we cannot drop that kid off and in a year come back and pick them up. Throughout the plan, we're going to be reviewing, we're going to be working discharge, and we're going to be working to get them in a lower level of care.
And what I wanted to add here is some of your qualified residential treatment programs may be some of the same programs that you were already seeing across the state. For instance, your East Arkansas Youth Shelter or your CYS or your Lone Oak Open Arms. But just know that the contracts are different and the requirements are different. And our QRTP providers have been working very closely with Bridget and Megan, all of us in central office, to make the changes. And again, that discharge planning and aftercare is going to be huge. So they're going to be part of this team with you.
Oh, it froze.
Uh-oh, it froze.
Oh, did it die? We're having a little technical difficulty. Maybe Russell can just move us forward. Is it really? Maybe it's completely frozen. Okay. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, requirements for QRTP placement, but one of the big things is every child that goes into a QRTP placement is going to have an assessment within 30 days of placement, court review and approval within 60 days, and evidence at the review and permanency planning hearing of they still need to be there. So there's going to be a lot of requirements and additional information that's given to you guys, but just know there is a lot of requirements, but also oversight to ensure that kids that are going into qualified residential treatment program are really getting the treatment and the services they need, and they're working a plan to discharge. So to get us in line with the federal requirements for QRTP, the team, Megan Bush's team, procured new contracts, and those were awarded a few months ago, and today they went live. There are 16 providers who were awarded QRTP contracts, and we funded 200 beds. Now let me just say that those 200 beds were based on months of work and looking at data of who are our current kids in placement, what are their current diagnoses, what are their needs, and trying to determine what do we need in the state. So through a thorough data analysis, the team really determined that we think that we needed about 200 beds to meet the requirements of our population. So then the team began QRTP transition planning, with hopefully many of you who are watching have been a part of that, because we wanted to take a very individual approach, right? We don't want to be black and white and just say, QRTP, move kids out, move kids in, right? Because that's not how we operate. We want to make decisions that are best for that individual child, which meant we had to look at both with the field and us, each child. Megan Bush and Bridget Williams staffed those cases with you guys at the local field and made sure that you were making good decisions for individual kids to get them with the family or to determine whether they met the QRTP requirements. And so as of today, the first day of QRTP, we have 150 kids in QRTP. You go back a second? There we go. I was just making sure that. Oh, so the additional point I wanted to make is until we get the assessment process in place, you will continue to email Bridget Williams and the application and to make sure that we're getting the right kids. Bridget's in the room with me and giving me a look, and I'm like, okay. So anyway, continue to email the application so that we can assess and make sure the right kids are getting into the QRTP program, because it's really important not just that the kids are in the right program, but we want kids of similar characteristics in the program. You don't want to have a program that's full of 15 to 17-year-olds who've been diagnosed with a serious emotional disturbance. And then I'll give you an example, Maggie's House. Maggie's House has traditionally took very young children into a house parent model. If you go and put a 2 and a 3-year-old into a program that has 15 to 17-year-olds with serious emotional behavioral disturbances, you are not making a good decision for that 2 and 3-year-old. So the challenges related to placement. There's many requirements related to QRTP. There's tight time frames, and you're going to learn more about that, but time frames around assessment, time frames around getting court approval. So there's going to be a lot of work with your ad litem and OCC to get the court involved, and it has to happen very quickly. The other big challenge is we cannot leave kids sitting in residential indefinitely, so there's got to be effective discharge planning. You're going to need to build that relationship with the PASS and Medicaid. They're not going to do placements, but if we're really going to say that we're going to get kids out in the communities, we've got to be partnering with them to figure out how to get those supports to support the family, whether it's behavioral health support, like are they getting to the therapist? Are they getting their medications? And if you're having trouble with that or you're having pushback, please raise that up the chain. If you're having issues with the PASS, we need to know about those and support those because we want to make good decisions for kids. And then again, we have to continue to recruit and support the foster parents that we have for older youth. If we want our children with families, we got to put aside our personal differences and work with our foster parents. And then keys to placement successes. So we build off what we're already doing. We've been focused on placement since 2016, and we are just going to continue down this path. As I've already stated, we have room to go with relatives. I think that is a key place that we can make a huge impact on getting our kids with family is really looking at relatives. And please do not hear me. I am not saying any relative. I am saying safe and appropriate relatives, but we have to do an assessment. Is it a safety issue or is it a licensing issue? Because if it's a licensing issue, we as central office will support you and work through that. Recruiting, as again, a third time, recruiting foster parents, but also maintaining and supporting the foster parents that we have that take 10 to 17-year-old. Expansion of TFC. We are very committed to expansion of TFC and I've told our providers. So we're working closely with our providers to support their expansion.
And we have 3 new TFC providers starting today. The new TFC contract went in place today. And all of our former TFC providers were awarded a contract in 3 new TFC providers. So we're really excited about that.
And I think that sometimes we forget is a huge piece not only what's right for kids, but also our daily work, whether it's resource or whether it's implementing Family First, is moving kids through the system. And if you've heard me speak, you know it's a soapbox of mine. There should not be a bureaucratic reason that a child is remaining in foster care, meaning some child should not be sitting or lingering in foster care because we can't figure out who's on first base to push the paperwork through, right? We should not have a kid sitting in foster care because we won't ask OCC for an earlier court date. We should not have kids sitting in foster care because we have not expanded visitation because we don't have time to call a staffing. The quicker that we move kids safely to permanency, we reduce our workloads, but more importantly, we do what's right for children. More placement options, better outcomes for kids. We have to take ownership of our kids and move them through the system to a safe and permanent place. And then we have to partner with our communities, which I think we're doing a good job of, but there's more work. Yes, we are responsible for 4,300 children, but it is okay to ask for help. And it is okay if people are questioning your work, they question mine. But if it's what's right for kids and they can come work alongside us, then that's what we need to be doing for kids. So, and I'm going to segue from placement to prevention, which is the second part of Family First. So, previously, the feds have not funded prevention in any way. We made prevention a focus and a bucket back in 2016. We haven't been able to do as much as we would like to do because of lack of funding, but this is an opportunity to actually use federal funding to strengthen families we serve on in-home with quality prevention services, something that we as a state have really lacked. So you'll move on. So why are prevention services needed in Arkansas? I mean, I know y'all know this, but sometimes you don't see the big picture, which is DCFS investigates 30,000 allegations of abuse or neglect. We opened 5,475 in-home cases, and we served 13,343 children. We served more children in home than we did in foster care. But here's the thing, guys. It can't just be about going out and seeing a family, determining whether the abuse or neglect happened, and then determining whether they have to come into foster care. It's much bigger than that. You know, we should be working with those families to strengthen them, to prevent future maltreatment, to effectively assess risk. Is there all these risk factors around this family that say they're at risk for future maltreatment? How do we get in there and really work with that family? And I think the way to do that is have effective evidence-based prevention services in Arkansas, which we have never really had in the past, substantially. So how does this work fit in what we're already doing in Arkansas? So we currently have 3 evidence-based programs, 2 of which are new within the last intensive in-home services is new within the last 6 months. Safe Care is new within the last 2 or 3 years. And Nurturing Families has been around longer. And so we don't, as you can see, even though there's 3 programs, there's not statewide coverage of all those programs. There hasn't been expansive of the population. So this is an area where we have room to grow. Now also notice all 3 evidence-based programs are provided by a provider, which is really neat for our staff. They can work with that family, but then they can refer for an evidence-based program. Now, we can't start pulling down additional federal funds until October, and you have to grow a program, you got to hire staff. So you're not going to see these changes overnight, but these are the changes that are headed our direction to where we can really do more than just assess, remove, or not remove, and did the allegation happen or not happen, but really get in there and engage with the family, assess their risk, and prevent future maltreatment, because that's what we want to do. So I kind of talked a little bit about the challenges. The challenges are that the federal funding is really limited in scope and eligibility, which is super complicated, and I'm not going to get in here, but as we roll out additional Family First trainings, we're going to go through the different terms that you'll hear. You'll hear candidate for foster care. You'll hear how we've defined that. You'll hear about how services are up to 12 months, but wow, guys, like an ability to get a service for up to 12 months for a family, Many requirements related to eligibility and types of covered services. So what I mean by covered services is it has to be an evidence-based service approved by the Fed. So as you can see, if you're thinking, well, we have counseling, or we have this, or we have IFS, it has to be an evidence-based program for us to pull down services. Okay, keys to, sorry, I thought Becky was about to say something. Keys to prevention success. So we're going to continue to increase effective prevention strategies. We're going to continue to increase statewide coverage. But guys, it's not just about us as DCFS saying we want to go statewide. We are a rural state. We have to find providers and partners who can find a workforce, who can hire, who can train, and all that takes time. A key to prevention success is effectively assessing risk. And you're going to hear from Leslie Seaburn and her team as we come into the next 6 months about that, really looking at the risk factors around a family, domestic violence, history, doing a better job of looking at in-state history and out-of-state history. How can you assess a family if your key priority is not looking at their history? Like, that is a key to assessing risk. Did you want to add something? No, you're just pointing. She keeps pointing at the PowerPoint, and I was like, oh, join me, Becky, join me. And then really strengthening families, which I mean really getting in there and preventing that maltreatment. And so, oh, this is our last slide, but Nicole's telling me we're okay in time, so we can do, we have plenty of time for question and answer. And if my box is right, I've got no questions. Is it right? But please, like, start submitting questions. We tried to go quickly to answer have time to take questions. I believe you type them in. So you're going to type them in, and then I will see them in my little box on the here we go. Yeah, okay, so I got my first question. Will the PowerPoint be sent to us? I'd be happy to share the PowerPoint. And apparently this person asked me a question anonymously. So you can ask me a question anonymously, apparently.
I can go ahead and answer a question that I get a lot across the state since we've started the new intensive in-home services. And that is, currently the intensive in-home services is in 37, is that right, Bridget? 37 counties. It's going to be in the top part of Area 5, your Boone, Marion, Baxter, Newton. And then Area 8, you have Fulton, Izzard, Sharp, Randolph. And then it's in, I think, all of Area 9. And it is in all of Area 10, and then it has some lower counties, your Bradley, Cleveland, Lincoln, and Area 7, and some of your lower counties, your Union, Columbia, Lafayette, Miller, and Little River in Area 4. So that is a question that I've gotten several times when I've been out in the field recently. So that is the new intensive in-home services, the counties.
Okay, so Becky, we've gotten a few more questions. I actually got 2 people asking this one. Who are the 3 new TFC providers?
Second Chance Ranch, and many of you are familiar with Second Chance Ranch. They've been a provider in the state for many years. So Second Chance Ranch is one of our new TFC providers. And Friendship Services, which is one of our DDS providers. And the third one is YouthBridge. So that's our 3 new TFC providers across the state. And again, remember, all of our previous TFC providers all received contracts starting today, and those are just 3 additional providers that we're very excited about because we've been trying to expand TFC now for a couple years.
Now, Becky was just talking about intensive in-home services, but we did get a question about where you can find more information about intensive in-home services. Like Becky said, it's only in 37 counties. We can send out information to everybody about that program. We hope if the program does well, it has an official valuation. We can continue the expansion, but right now it's in 37 counties, and we can put out some additional information about the specifics of how that program works. But it is where they go in the home. It's not just mental health focused. They're working on parenting. They're working on wrapping around supports in the community. So,
and it is really different than
it really
the
is
IFS service. Very intense. They're on call 24/7. They're in the homes initially if they need to be 7 days a week, minimum 3 days a week. And I apologize because I asked Bridget Williams, and it's Letitia Young that is over that program, and Letitia's not in the room, but it is 37 counties.
So I did just get a question that says, I believe I missed the date that children have to be officially out of the facilities. There's no date. So if you had a child that was in a residential treatment, you have staffed with Bridget or Megan, and the kids are where they need to be today. So Bridget and Megan, if they are in a new QRTP, they are there. Bridget and Megan have confirmed that they are there. If they are not there, you have already worked with them and they have moved to either a foster home, a relative, or a family style care. So there is no date where you run and get your kids and move them. So we have already worked to transition. Now, if you have concern about whether your kid is in a placement and they're not appropriate, please reach out to Bridget and the local team, and so you can get that staffed. I'm still continuing. Now they're coming fast now, you know. I've already answered, but will in-home services be implemented in the rest of the counties? That is our hope and our plan, but first we got to see the outcomes. We got to see that it works, and so it will be an expansion that meets up with the program. Okay.
And I'll take this one. If we open a provisional home as a therapeutic foster home, does it take longer? It is going to take a little longer, but if it's long-term, what's right for that child, and the example I gave earlier, that child had been in residential for a long time. So working with that TFC provider to see when it's appropriate, they'll work with that family to get that family appropriate trained, but it's every case is going to be different. So what I suggest is if you have a family that you feel like would need TFC to care for their fictive kin or their relative, to see if it's appropriate, just email Bridget Williams and Megan Bush, and they will help walk you through that and work with TFC providers across the state to make that a success. And I think we've actually done that with a couple of relatives and fictive kin. I also want to say that going back to the intensive in-home, now I know it's only in 37 counties. However, Bridget and Megan worked, Letitia, I keep giving Bridget intensive in-home because I'm looking at her, but Letitia worked with Bridget and Megan and the field staff on a child, an older youth that had been stuck on a contract in a subacute facility, and they worked with them to get that child back home and intensive in-home services to that family. So the intensive in-home services can work that way as well. So there's a lot of just every case is different. You've got that difficult case that you think the child can go back home, but mom needs some more services. They worked real closely to get that intensive in-home services.
I got a lot of questions. Here we go, move on. We got a lot of questions. So what do you do when an ad litem won't let a child go home and they are just hanging in foster care, but a sibling is already home? So there's a lot of different ways to handle this. The one way is not to just sit there and take it, right? So you need to first reach out to the ad litem and get a clear understanding of why they're not recommending that they're going home. If their explanation is just a compliance issue and not a safety issue, I would go ahead and email it up the chain so that we can reach out to that ad litem supervisor. Number two, you need to make sure that you can really articulate why it is appropriate for that child to go home. Because many times I hear when we're staffing cases, they can't really articulate why there is not a safety concern or why those safety concerns have been addressed. So staff with your supervisor and then go ahead and reach out to OCC and get a court date, because ultimately it's not the ad litem, it's the court that you have to be convincing. But try the first step of working with that ad litem and making sure that you understand her reasoning. But again, I appreciate that you're advocating. Don't just let it sit there. You want to take one?
Policy. There's one about will a policy come out on QRTP and TFC? And yes, policy will come out on QRTP, but also Megan and Bridget are going to be getting in the weeds with you on, like Misha said earlier, on the details of the QRTP, the CRIS screen. So that is coming shortly. On TFC, there's not a lot of changes to TFC, but yeah, we will give you some guidance on the changes with TFC too. I know one of the big changes with TFC is sibling placements. So we are working with our TFC providers to get more sibling placements, and they've been doing that for a while with us, but we did increase the board that went to the TFC providers, so they can work closer with the siblings and ensure that we get more siblings placed at TFC together.
And I just want to piggyback too off that question that has been asked. You know, central office is supposed to be a support for the field, but you also have to realize that the placement team, when it comes to specialized placement, is Bridget Williams. And when it comes to family style setting, it's Tiffany and Lacey. We have limited staff in central office to assess with placements. So and we want to support you, and you're bringing the application so that we can, you know, we have experts who work with the providers, but just as much as I expect Bridget and Megan to know the providers and connect with the providers, it's really essential that you know your providers in your community, but not just providers, you know your foster homes, you know, because we want to support you, but one person for 4,300 kids and 1,100 DCFS staff, we cannot make placements for you at central office. And really that wouldn't be right for kids, but we want to support you in your efforts to figure out what's appropriate for your child. So will there be a change in standards of approval for foster and adoptive homes to make provisionals as accountable as regular and foster and adoptive homes? I'm going to follow back up with you and ask some follow-up questions, specifically what your concerns are, but about accountability. I do think that we have a responsibility to support those relatives. I frequently talk to relatives and they're getting opened in the middle of the night and they've never even interacted with the foster care system. We talk in different language. They don't know court process. They don't understand what just happened. They're probably upset with their relative. So I'm not sure really what you mean by accountability, so I'll follow up and ask some questions. But I do know that it's critical that we do a great job of opening really quickly. We have to be back in there with those relatives, and hopefully the resource, we're doing a pilot in Area 5, and if it works, hopefully we'll be able to get some pointers and expand. But we have to do a better job of connecting and then following up with those relatives, both resource and foster care.
And I'll just add to that, for relatives, there's fostering connections. So, you know, relatives are different. If you can waive something with a relative, as long as it's not a safety issue, we might waive something with a relative that we would not waive for a regular foster home. So there is some difference. And even the example I gave earlier with the grandmother that had a 15-year-old neglect charge, we'd look at that different for a relative than we would for a non-relative.
So because this is an anonymous question, I'm just going to go ahead and address it because I don't know how to address it to the person because they ask it anonymously. But there's a long example of an issue with Optum, PCP, and assessment. And again, I kind of said this earlier, but if you're having problems that are related to Medicaid and the PASS and PCP, it is fine. Just go ahead and ask. Send that up to Bridget. Maybe Bridget can't answer it, but we will ask our folks at DMS. We're working a lot of these from across the state, so I need to flesh out some additional information on. I can't answer your question because I got some additional questions about what exactly happened on this case, but we are more than happy to help and to look at that and figure it out and work with our partners at DMS because clearly there's some type of PCP referral issue going on in your area. So will there be any changes to training for relatives or fictive kin to become approved foster homes? Often the academy is not meeting training to meet the 6 month time frames. Could there be an alternate training for relatives and fictive kin? We have explored this as an option. Right now there's no current plan for that, but we have on multiple occasions as a team explored that as an option. Finding a partner or going through Mid-South is have been discussed, but ultimately we have to get those relatives open in 6 months. So in your specific area, if it is a problem, I need you to email Kristen Harper and Tiffany Wright because Kristen's over the Mid-South training contract and Tiffany deals with training foster parents, so that maybe at least until we can do something more long-term, we can at least hopefully address the concerns in your area and get relatives into training.
And I'll take one. It says, what does family first mean for children who come into care because of failed adoption, who the behaviors of the child present a danger to a regular foster home? Well, I'm gonna talk about two things. First of all, if you're in one of the counties and we can use our intensive in-home service, we can use that for our adoption cases that need support, or there's other support. We need to really be working with those adoption cases early on before it's a failed adoption. However, If it is a failed adoption and the child does come into care, then of course we'll take that and we'll work closely with you on what's best for that child, but it may be that a QRTP is best for that child. We will obviously work and see what is best for that child and help you work through that.
So, I mean, to answer that question, and I agree with Becky, so the federal law does allow for additional funding to be pulled down for some pre-adoptive services for failed adoptions, but we have to have the service in place, right? So that's something, you know, that's one of the reasons that we looked at the intensive in-home services, but we still believe that that child belongs in a family. So he or she may need treatment, like Becky said, go into that QRTP, and frankly, they may be coming back into care. If the foster home, and, you know, we've had too many cases where we force families to keep kids, and we do that, we end up with abused or neglected children. So I'm not saying we just run and take every almost a failed adoption, but again, I'll use Becky's word. We have to assess that. They may need treatment. They may need to go back to a family. I mean, I can think of a very recent case where the family really alleged that child was a danger. That child ultimately did come into foster care because we're not going to force a family to take a kid that they don't want. That kid is thriving in a foster home right now. Yes, he needed some treatment, but thriving. We are several months, probably coming up on a year, of that child thriving in a foster family. So I'm not going to say just because it's a failed adoption and the foster home alleges that they're a danger, that means that they can't ever be in a family again.
And could you share who are the new TFC providers and the newly awarded QRT providers? Yes, we will. We'll share that with you. And I think I already shared that the new TFC providers is pretty easy because there's 3 of them. But it's Second Chance Ranch, and it's Youth Bridge, and it is Friendship Services. But we'll get a list of that out on who the new providers are for TFC, and then also the QRTP providers. And while we're doing that, we'll just go ahead and add the emergency shelter providers, because there are a couple emergency shelters, I believe, that have closed, and then a couple of programs that elected just to stay emergency shelters. So I'm looking at Bridget, and we'll get that out.
And so one question is, how's Family First gonna impact resource homes, provisional, and other foster homes? It's not, because the feds continue to fund them. So we will continue along our policies and values to recruit, support our resource or foster families. We will continue to hopefully, not just continue, but increase our provisional placements and other foster homes, and we will continue to pull down federal funding to support those placements.
If a relative is going to be approved as a TFC provider, who will provide support to that TFC provider will be local staff. If they're open and approved as a TFC provider, they will receive the same support. That family will be a TFC family, and they will continue to receive all the support that a TFC provider provides to all their other TFC families. They will be a TFC family. And of course, as you know, DCFS still is part of the team and works to provide support. But yes, they will get all the other supports, all the supports that the other TFC providers receive.
Will the number of days change regarding how long a youth can remain in a shelter? No. I mean, the answer, if you want a black and a white answer, the answer is no. But our policies and practice have been that if you put a child in a shelter, you are immediately looking for a more permanent placement, because we cannot have kids to grow up in a shelter, nor is that is not good for them. That is not in line with our values. And so will the feds stop funding after 14 days? Absolutely they will. But am I telling you that on day 15 you have to go pick up your kid? No, but probably starting in the next few months, you're going to be hearing from somebody in central office every single day your kid is in a shelter saying, what are you doing to plan for their permanency? Because emergency shelter is what it is. It is an emergency shelter. It is meant to be a place that when you take a kid in the middle of the night, if there is no appropriate family, then they will, and there's no appropriate relative, there's no appropriate foster home, there's no care other than sleeping in the office, that you will go to that emergency shelter, that child will stay there for a short term until you can find an appropriate long-term permanent placement. But we are going to start asking you, and we've been asking, what's your plan? What is your plan? You can't just have kids sit there indefinitely.
And when will the new TFC providers home be available? Well, the contract went into place today. with the new providers, but we know they all have to recruit and train homes. So they're available today. Their contract is in place today, but it may take them a little time to recruit and train the homes.
How do we know if we need to send a denied relative up to Little Rock for an alternative compliance? Is there a specific date of child maltreatment that we have to come up with that we need to send to Little Rock? So I'm not aware of a specific rule, policy, or directive I have given about sending a denied relative. If you're assessing at that local level and you're determining that that relative is not safe and appropriate, Becky, you want to?
At one time, and I don't know if this is still what's happening, but at one time the denied relatives were coming up to Angie just so we could look at the practice issues and even practice issues, making sure, like the example I gave you earlier, making sure we're going to do what's right for every child. And maybe 3 years ago, we wouldn't have even looked at that grandmother that had a 15-year-old neglect charge because it was central registry. But if it's right for that child, and assessing that grandmother now, we will look at that. So I think those were coming up to Angie, and I can follow up with Angie, and I'm assuming they are still, denied relatives are still coming up to her since we got that question.
Yeah, and it was just to make sure that we're really making not necessarily good decisions. It was making sure that we weren't denying relatives based on some old practice that was kind of out of date. Okay, to piggyback on the ad litem's preventing a child from returning home when a sibling is already at home, will OCC adequately defend us and help us fight this case? It doesn't always happen now. Let me just say this. If it's not happening, I don't want to hear like, oh, I can't work with OCC. I need a specific case, specifically what happened in the courtroom. I need it to be sent up your chain of command, and it needs to get sent over to the leadership at OCC. If they are consistently not defending you in court, which is their job, I need specifics of what happened, and I need to share it with their leadership. I am more than happy to communicate those issues to their leadership, and if things don't change and there are good examples, then we will take action. I'm trying to, some of these are kind of repetitive. Okay, so we got 3 minutes. Lots of question about these TFC providers. I mean, even though we have a new TFC contract, things are still status quo with TFC. And the new providers for TFC, we have our same old providers, we have new TFC providers. They're going to have to find and recruit homes. They're going to have to, get people to want to be foster homes, and then they're going to have to train them. Yes, everything's the same as far as going through the placement unit and making sure that the application is placed. We know that we have a lot of children that need TFC. We know that we need our providers to expand, but they have the same problem as us. They have to find a family that's willing to open and take kids. I'm sorry, I'm looking. We get some long questions. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I got 3 minutes. I'm going to take this long question. And thank you, Greg Moore. You're confirming that denied relatives are a part of the report to Angie. I don't actually see those, but yes, Angie Newcomb is reviewing those. So we can talk about that practice as well and see if that needs to be updated. We recently had a staffing that all parties, not DCFS, was in agreement that the relative placement located was in the best interest of the child. This carried over to the judge who agreed. Should we go ahead and send in backgrounds just in case the children linger in care longer than we would like? Did I misread that?
I'm confused about that.
I'm going to have to follow up because I don't understand that question. Maybe I'm just missing it, but that person was not anonymous, so we will follow up individually.
Yeah, and I'll write that name down, so we'll follow up.
But and if we've missed some questions, we are just trying to go down the list, but if we've missed some questions, we will go back through these, and there may be some follow-up questions because sometimes I'm seeing some of these and I don't necessarily understand or where you're coming from. But I mean, that's the good thing about this question answer session is we can do some follow-up. But please know that if you're seeing a policy or a practice that does not align that you're doing what's best for children or that it supports that children should be in a family, please ask us at central office. Again, We are here for support. The chain of command is through Angie Newcomb, but the placement unit through Megan Bush, the prevention unit through Leslie Seaburn, and on. Those are program supports to help answer some of these policy questions. We have Kristen Harper, who's over policy. If you have a question, her and her staff are always more than happy to answer it. Like sometimes there seems to be a disconnect between us and the field, but we encourage, like if you're frustrated about something, if you have a question, you don't think that it aligns with the value or you're concerned, please raise it up and let's get some clarification around it. And I know that I'm 1 minute from being out of time, so I really want to say thank you to everybody who viewed this via Zoom. If there were technology issues, we will figure out a way that you can express those, because we're hoping over the next few months as we continue to roll out Family First and CRIS enhancements and a whole bunch of other stuff, that we're able to use technology more so that we can get to you and make it convenient so you don't have to travel anywhere, and that we can get the information out quickly. So thank you so much for joining Zoom, and I will see you next time.
Thank you.